Okay, good morning or good afternoon in Geneva. I'm Gianpaolo Pioli, President of the United Nations Correspondent Association, and we are pleased to host this press conference here this morning with the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International about Saudi Arabia role in the Human Rights Council. The panel is Philippe Boulepion, Deputy Director for Global Advocacy at Human Rights Watch, Sarah Lee Winston, Executive Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch, Richard Benner, Representative Head of Amnesty International UN Office, and Tawanda Mutasa, Senior Director International Law and Policy at Amnesty International. We are pleased to have all of them here. It will be an interesting panel. We also ask the Saudi Arabian ambassador if he want to do a similar event or attend to this event. I hope they will do it, and they take another opportunity to give their voice on this subject. And now I give the floor to Philippe. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Gianpaolo, and thank you very much for hosting this press conference. I realize it created a bit of angst in the Saudi mission, but we really appreciate this opportunity. I want to mention as well that this conference is, there is a webcast for journalists who are based in Geneva, and they will be able to submit questions as well by email through one of my colleagues. And I also want to acknowledge in the room our researcher Priyanka Motaparty, with our senior emergencies researcher, who was in Yemen during the spring, and who would be available to do one-on-one interviews for anyone interested after this. So today is a somehow rare event. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have decided to join forces to jointly call for Saudi Arabia to be suspended from the Human Rights Council. It's an exceptional call, something we do extremely rarely, but we believe that over the last few months, Saudi Arabia has gone beyond the pale and does not deserve anymore to sit on the Human Rights Council. It's based on its record of extremely severe violations in Yemen, a domestic record that is as appalling as ever, as well as efforts to prevent scrutiny of what it's been doing in Yemen through its seat at the Human Rights Council, and effort to blackmail its way out of the UN list of shame, which I know all of you are well aware of. So we'll get a bit into the detail of why we are doing this. My colleague Tawanda Mutasa is going to explain to you a bit the rationale for making this call and how we came to this decision. My colleague Sarah Lee Whitson will then get into the detail of the violations that we have documented in Yemen. And when I say we, it's both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, whose research has been closely tracking each other. And finally, my colleague Richard Bennett will get a bit more into the detail of the domestic record of Saudi Arabia and what it's been doing under the Human Rights Council. So without further ado, Tawanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and good morning to you, and good afternoon, good evening in Geneva. General Assembly Resolution 6251 enjoins and enables the General Assembly to suspend a member state that has committed gross and systematic violations of human rights. The General Assembly can do so by 2/3 majority of members present and sitting and available. And this was provided for within this resolution and has previously been used in the case of Libya. And this is the call that we are making now in relation to Saudi Arabia, where we are saying because of the gross and systematic violations of human rights that Saudi Arabia has committed domestically, but also as the leader in Riyadh of the Saudi Arabia-led coalition that from March 2015 has committed violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It is appropriate for the General Assembly to be called upon to suspend the membership rights of Saudi Arabia. Suspension of membership rights of a country does not mean that the country ceases to cooperate. For instance, with mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, such as the Universal Periodic Review. But it does mean effectively that the state loses its rights of membership, voting rights, advanced speaking rights, and so on. Effectively, basically, it is suspended from a body. This is, as Philip indicated, an unusual call that we are making. We are making the call advisedly on the basis of the gross and systematic violations of human rights that have been perpetrated over the time when Saudi Arabia has been a member of the Human Rights Council, where it has used its membership to shield itself from scrutiny and from accountability for the violations that it has been perpetrating, where it has cynically manipulated processes within the Human Rights Council that would have led to impartial, transparent investigations and independent investigations into the violations that it is perpetrating in Yemen and at home. We know from what we have recently seen in terms of how Saudi Arabia has managed to take itself off the list of shame for violations of international humanitarian law against children, that Saudi Arabia does have powerful backers and can twist out of scrutiny by having those backers support it, as we have seen with the list of shame. And this is why it is particularly important for a call like this to be made straightforwardly. Lastly, I would say at this stage that we have, of course, the obligation to call upon member states of the General Assembly to exercise what they have put in their own resolution by making this call. But at the same time, it's important for us as an international community to safeguard the integrity of the Human Rights Council itself, particularly in the year of its 10th anniversary, so that the Human Rights Council is taken seriously and does not fail in the same way that its predecessor failed. And so we are making this call on the basis of the violations that my colleague is going to catalogue, but also on the basis of Saudi Arabia using its membership in the Human Rights Council to shield itself from accountability, and also because it does matter for the international community to safeguard the integrity and importance of the Human Rights Council. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Tawanda. So we can now go to Sarah Lee Whitson, who is the Executive Director of our Middle East and North Africa Division. Sarah Lee.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm glad we're here today to review the record that has led us to make this call to suspend Saudi Arabia from the Human Rights Council. And I think it's important to distinguish the very muddy political narratives about why this indiscriminate bombardment campaign is being carried out in Saudi Arabia, which is not really our concern, and what our concern is and what we do know very clearly, which is the manner in which this war is being conducted, and the manner in which there is a catastrophe that's being waged in Yemen against the Yemeni people, with over 3,000 civilian deaths and wide-scale destruction of homes and infrastructure. What we do know is that Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition has violated the most basic norms of international humanitarian law, prohibiting the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas and the use of banned weapons such as cluster munitions, with starking parallels in the manner in which this war is being conducted to the aerial indiscriminate bombardment in Gaza. We ourselves have documented, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, at least 69 coalition strikes that appear to have been unlawfully indiscriminate, some of which we believe have amounted to war crimes. Just the strikes that we have documented have killed at least 913 civilians, including 200 children, which is why Saudi Arabia found itself on the Secretary General's list of shame. We've documented a very wide-scale pattern of deliberate attacks on hospitals and medical centers, schools and markets, and the United Nations' own panel of experts and the High Commissioner for Human Rights have documented a very wide pattern of unlawful strikes, basically echoing our own findings. Significantly, in light of the new treaty that bans the use of cluster munitions, we have documented Saudi Arabia's repeated use of American and British-supplied cluster munitions in civilian areas. We know that the coalition has used at least 5 different types of cluster munitions in or near civilian populated areas, including at Sana'a University and several residential neighborhoods. We have documented 19 different cluster munition strikes, which for a while Saudi Arabia was denying, but the incontrovertible physical evidence that we have gathered on the ground in Saudi Arabia makes it impossible to deny. I want to emphasize along that line because one of the primary defenses that we've seen the Saudi government make is that, well, you don't know, you haven't been on the ground, you're reporting based on Houthi propaganda and so forth. In fact, Human Rights Watch has had an office in Yemen for the past several years, and since the start of the war, we've had multiple research teams, along with Amnesty International, on the ground repeatedly, nearly continuously. I myself was in Yemen in March to witness firsthand the pattern of devastation we're seeing in the country. It's also important to note, as again, one of the regular defenses, I would say non sequitur defenses that we typically hear, is about a pattern and record of Houthi abuses. And I want to make perfectly clear that our organizations have, with equal vigor, with equal gusto, in fact, with an equal number of press releases, if you look at Human Rights Watch, documented Houthi abuses, including their own artillery rockets and indiscriminate attacks in southern cities and across the border into Saudi Arabia, which have killed dozens of civilians. We have documented Houthis' use of anti-personnel landmines, which have killed and wounded at least 21 people. And we have repeatedly documented the recruitment, training, and deployment of children during the conflict. In addition, of course, there has been a severe siege on Yemen's ports, which has dramatically limited the ability to import food and medicine in a country that was already on the brink of collapse. With commercial imports accounting for 90% of Yemen's food and fuel supplies, the coalition-imposed blockade has, according to the UN's own agencies, amounted to a starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and a war crime. We think it's also very important to note that in addition to the Saudi-led coalition, the 9 Arab states participating in this war, we believe that the United States and the United Kingdom have crossed the threshold to become a part of this war, and we have argued that they are also legally responsible for the crimes that are being committed on the ground in Yemen, because not only are they the principal weapons suppliers to Saudi Arabia, just in 2015, Saudi Arabia purchased over $20 billion of weapons from the United States, $500 million from France, and $4 billion from the UK. But they are also active participants in the war because they have admitted to providing intelligence support and targeting assistance to the Saudis in this war. These are the facts on the ground that we have documented and continue to document, and the primary reason we're making this call today.
Thank you, Sarah Lee. We'll now go to Richard Bennett, who is the head of Amnesty International's UN office. Richard?
Thank you, Philippe, and good morning in New York and good afternoon in Geneva. I'm going to outline the human rights violations committed domestically by Saudi Arabia, or at least some of them, and note that Resolution 60-251 that was referred to by my colleague applies to violations committed not only internationally but domestically. Since 2013, all of Saudi Arabia's prominent and independent human rights defenders have been imprisoned, threatened into silence, or have fled the country. Most of them had already been subject to arbitrary travel bans and had endured intimidation from and harassment by the security forces. Some were subsequently sentenced to harsh prison terms after grossly unfair trials in the Specialized Criminal Court, the Security and Counterterrorism Court. The counter-terror law, which took effect in February 2014, has been used to silence human rights defenders and peaceful activists, including through imprisonment, as I say. The law defines terrorist crimes in overly broad and vague manner and effectively criminalizes peaceful expression. All forms of peaceful gatherings and demonstrations in Saudi Arabia are banned. Even speaking to groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch is an offense. Saudi Arabia has taken some small steps to improve respect for women's rights, and we want to acknowledge that, though it has yet to abolish fully the male guardianship system of women who continue to face pervasive discrimination in all fields. Members of Saudi's Shia Muslim minority continue to face systematic discrimination. Shia leaders and activists have been arrested, imprisoned following unfair trials, and subject to the death penalty. Speaking of the death penalty, the authorities in Saudi have executed more than 350 people since 2014, including 47 people in a mass execution on the 2nd of January this year. At least 40% of executions have been for offences which under international law must not be punishable by death. I'd also like to next just to outline briefly Saudi's cooperation or lack of it with the Human Rights Council. It's already Saudi's use of its membership to prevent the creation of an international mechanism to investigate violations by parties to the Yemen conflict has already been referred to. Saudi Arabia currently has 7 outstanding requests from the Human Rights Council's Special Procedures Mechanism to visit the country, some of which date back 10 years. During its council membership and its previous term, Saudi has actively targeted NGOs and activists in order to prevent them cooperating with UN mechanisms and international NGOs. For example, Samar Badawi, a prominent human rights defender, made an oral intervention at the council during which Saudi's representatives attempted to silence her by interrupting her statement a number of times. Subsequently, the authorities prevented her from traveling to Brussels to attend an EU forum on human rights. Finally, and it's been referred to already, but just to finish, I'd like to say that although we are discussing Saudi Arabia today, we are also speaking to all members of the General Assembly. Failure to act on Saudi Arabia's gross and systematic human rights violations committed in Yemen and its use of its membership to obstruct independent scrutiny and accountability threatens the credibility of both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you all the panelists, and now the floor is open for question here and in Geneva. If we have someone from Geneva, okay. James Baker from Al Jazeera.
James Bays from Al Jazeera English. In terms of the dynamics at the UN, is there any chance in your estimation that this could actually happen, that you could get the votes given that you need a 2/3 majority? And this isn't the first time that there have been countries on the Human Rights Council that don't have good human rights records. Is this something you would like to start calling out more countries more often?
Yeah, so during Saudi Arabia's membership, both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have continued to regularly bring the attention of the Human Rights Council and the international community, and certainly the Human Rights Council member states to the egregious violations that Saudi Arabia is committing. And we have documented these, and we have seen the cynical use in October 2015 by Saudi Arabia of its membership when it derailed the effort to establish an independent, impartial, transparent, and credible investigation into, for instance, the Yemen violations. And we have seen the continuation of executions and so on that my colleague has referred to. in all these, we are realistic that Saudi clearly has powerful international backers. But it cannot be right that international backers such as, for instance, the US, the UK, some EU countries that have participated in supplying some of the use of the cluster munitions that we have documented between us and Human Rights Watch, can only be ready to make such a call for a country that is as isolated as Libya was when the previous 6251 call was made. And we think calls like this should be made on the basis of the reality of what operative paragraph 8 of resolution 6251 provides, which is that when a state has committed gross and systematic violations of human rights, it can be suspended from the council. So we think that far from being about whether this is realistic or not, it should be the challenge that we pose to the General Assembly to say you ought to be applying resolution 6251 and you ought to demonstrate why it should not be applied in the case of Saudi Arabia.
And just to elaborate a bit on that, I mean, there is no question that there are many other countries on the Human Rights Council that have a very questionable rights record, and we criticize them. There is Russia, there is China, there is Burundi, there is Ethiopia, there is the UAE. Sadly, there is a long list. But I would say that really Saudi Arabia is on a league of its own because of the severity of the crimes that they have committed in Yemen, because of how grim the domestic record is, but also because they have been able to get away with murder in a way that almost no other country gets away with. And it became very apparent when they successfully got off the list of shame of the UN after being put on it. They have been able to use their power and influence to shield themselves from criticism and scrutiny and accountability. So, will the UN General Assembly tomorrow suspend them? Well, probably not, sadly, but we believe that countries should start thinking about the credibility of the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council was created a decade ago because the Commission on Human Rights had lost its credibility precisely for these kind of things, because some egregious violators were sitting on the council and presiding it. So we also believe that the credibility of the Human Rights Council hangs in the balance here, and hopefully our call will be a wake-up call for countries that do believe in the Human Rights Council to clean up their act and make sure that you cannot sit on the council and pronounce yourself on human rights violations around the world when you are committing atrocious violations yourself.
Okay, other question? Somini
Hi there.
from the New York Times.
If you could, Sarah, expand a little bit on how you think the U.S. and U.K. are legally responsible. You talked about the supply of illegal munitions, but how would that work under international law? And secondly, just on a procedural issue, is there any member state that is ready to propose a resolution to bounce Saudi Arabia from the Human Rights Council?
Let me answer this one first. We are just launching, the call this minute. So we now are going to go to UN General Assembly member states. I know that Amnesty supporters around the world are going to demarche their governments. So the process is only starting, and it's a bit too early to say, whether some member states will show the courage to do the right thing on this. And Sarah, I'll let you answer though.
It's okay.
In terms of the argument that the United States in particular is an active participant in this war, it stems not in particular because of the transfer of arms, but in fact because of what Saudi Arabia has proclaimed is the fact, well ahead of the Pentagon admitting it's the fact, but belatedly doing so, that they are actually providing targeting assistance and refueling support, as well as other elements of actual military support to the air campaign. What we know, because the Saudi Arabians and the Americans have told us, is that they are sitting in the Riyadh Command Center, assisting the Saudis in picking targets. What we also know is that the target picking has been really bad and really a failure, and in several instances, we believe war crimes. So we believe that the United States could be complicit in these war crimes if they selected these targets. And that's why we have repeatedly asked the Pentagon to tell us exactly which targets it has assisted Saudi Arabia in picking, and whether it is any of these strikes, the over 69 strikes that we've documented, the over 119 strikes that the UN has documented, that have been unlawful.
Yes. And
And my colleague Joyce will also let us know if there is a
there's
question.
no,
from
they're not.
from-
I ask. Yeah.
It's
yet.
Kai Clement from ARD German Radio. I was wondering whether you would say that the UN system is failing here, since it hasn't supported the Secretary General when he took Saudi Arabia from the blacklist. There was no support whatsoever from member states. So what is the UN system doing here? Is it failing, and has it abandoned the Secretary General?
Richard, you want to take this one?
Well, I think that's a good question. Certainly, you didn't mention the case of Morocco, but that was not so long ago as well. And when Saudi was removed recently from the Children in Armed Conflict list, the Secretary General himself ultimately made a statement talking about the very difficult position he was put in, the intimidation by Saudi Arabia, and indeed the lack of support from other member states. So it is a good question, and that is why we are saying that this is not only a matter of credibility for the Human Rights Council in its 10th year, important as that is, it's also a matter of the credibility of the General Assembly and the United Nations system as a whole.
Carla. Okay. And there is another one from Geneva after that, right? You read it.
Thank you very much for this briefing. It seems that the Secretary General is the ultimate whistleblower on the way the United Nations operates, and possibly the reasons why it fails in so many ways. If he could be pressured and blackmailed into retracting what you are all saying is a legitimate criticism of Saudi Arabia, he must have had enormous pressure from enormously powerful
Do you have a question?
backers. And it's particularly shocking, this is new, that the Pentagon is
Can we get a
providing
question?
targeting and
Carla?
assistance. The question is, well, I'd like to reiterate his question. What are the odds of anything getting accomplished under these circumstances? And as far as Richard Bennett's comment that peaceful demonstrators are persecuted in Saudi Arabia, this was the reason why the Security Council has attempted regime change in Syria. Why is Saudi Arabia exempt from any Security Council action? And is this because they have powerful backing by the US and the UK?
Thank you.
Turn up.
Yep. Thank you very much for that question. It is precisely the reality of powerful backers that we have spoken to that we need to make sure is out of the way of accountability. At the Security Council, Amnesty International, for instance, has been making the call, and Human Rights Watch is also making a similar call to ensure that the veto is not exercised. There is a voluntary restraint on the exercise of the veto in situations of mass atrocity crimes. So we have crimes under international law, and we have a veto. Those things cannot be sitting together in terms of international law. Therefore, that call is about accountability, however powerful a state might be. In the case of the Secretary General and the establishment of the list of shame, we have documented several violations, international humanitarian law violations against children in the context of Yemen. In Amnesty International's reports alone, we have seen in at least 33 coalition airstrikes that can be classified as unlawful. At least 127 children having been victims of those strikes. In such a situation, we've even, in the latest field mission that our researchers undertook, they found, for instance, children, survivors, that were playing with submunitions that were then exploding in their faces and maiming children and killing some. In all these situations, it cannot be right that the General Assembly can fold its hands, that the Security Council can fold its hands in the other cases that we are alluding to, that the Human Rights Council can fold its hands. And that's why we are saying this call is a start to be able to say there is accountability that's needed here in terms of international impartial investigation of the crimes that are being perpetrated in Yemen and also the domestic violations.
And just to add, I mean, we are not naive. We realize that the odds are against us. And as a human rights activist, it's not unusual for us to go against tremendous odds. But I would first remark that, you know, the fact that we are issuing that call seems to be creating some anxiety within the Saudian government, and that in and of itself, I think, is a good thing. I would also underline the fact that it's very likely that Saudi Arabia will run a campaign later this year to be re-elected on the Human Rights Council. So I think our efforts to expose their record will hopefully get somehow in the way of this campaign. So at the end of the day, if we only called for things that would happen right away, we would never do anything of value. But we really believe that it's the right thing to do, and we believe that it will have impact on the situation. And if that's okay, maybe I think we have a question
from Geneva. Yes, let me run that.
Yeah, it's a question not from Geneva, but from someone watching the live stream, Mark Leon Goldberg from UN Dispatch. Can you describe in more detail how you believe Saudi Arabia uses its position on the Human Rights Council to subvert Yemen probe?
Richard, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Well, what we've referred to already is that, and I'll give a bit more detail. In October. In October 2015, Saudi Arabia used its membership to derail a resolution to establish an international investigation into allegations of war crimes and other violations of international humanitarian law committed by the military coalition that it leads in Yemen. And it garnered a rival resolution backing a Yemen inquiry. 9 months on, that inquiry has failed to carry out an effective, impartial investigation into violations in Yemen or to hold anyone accountable. If you need more detail still, the resolution that was drafted, the initial resolution was drafted by the Netherlands. It was withdrawn. And a subsequent draft resolution tabled by Saudi was adopted. Perhaps I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and just to add, it was particularly shameful. I think there were almost no precedents, or very few in the Human Rights Council, for a country that's bombing another one to be the one drafting the resolution of this country. So yes. Saudi Arabia ended up drafting the resolution that was commenting on the human rights situation in Yemen, and unsurprisingly, it ended up being a very weak resolution. And frankly, they were allowed to do this because they were left to hang high and dry by many Western countries that are very quick to criticize human rights violations in other places.
Pamela Farr from CBS.
Thank you very much, Gianpaolo. My question is about the Committee and Armed Conflict report that will, by definition, I believe, have to come out in August. That just leaves this month for the investigation of Saudi Arabia and the blacklist. But the terms of it have not been agreed to. Do you think it will be pushed back, or will this report actually come out? And could you also, and it's for Philippe or Richard or everyone on the panel, could you explain where other Gulf states are, Jordan and other states? They've been somewhat outspoken in defense of Saudi Arabia. So have you spoken with them and with the Saudis about all of this? Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I'll take the first one on the committee. I think you refer to the committee, or I don't know exactly how it's called. We're supposed to look again into whether Saudi Arabia should be on the list of shame. And maybe, Tawanda, you can take the question about other members of the coalition. Look, we think that, the facts are beyond dispute. There is no need to establish a new committee or investigative body to look into whether Saudi Arabia deserves to be on the list of shame. They do deserve to be on the list of shame. Yemen has become one of the most hellish places on earth for children since Saudi Arabia's coalition started bombing the country. It's been documented by Human Rights Watch. It's been documented by Amnesty International. It's been documented by the UN office, OHCHR. It's been documented by the panel of experts mandated by the Security Council. So you cannot, establish the facts more firmly than that. So any investigative body looking back into this is obviously created for political reasons or as a saving way for the UN to do something which was incredibly shameful, which was to give into the Saudi bullying and blackmailing to get off the list of shame. So we are not holding our breath for the result of this investigative body.
Thank you.
If,
Joe.
can I just ask Philippe as a follow-up, if you don't mind? Has anyone contacted Leila Zarougi and the people at CAAC? I mean, is there any sense of how they feel? Do they feel betrayed about this report? No, I haven't heard anything about it from them.
I have met with Leila Zarougi since this happened. I'm sure that you may wish to speak to her directly, but I can say that their greatest concern, they are confident that the report they made is accurate and their recommendations are justified, just as Philippe has said. And they have not relied on information from Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or other NGOs. They have relied on UN information, I'm told. And finally, I think what is of great concern is to protect that mandate to protect children involved in armed conflict. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the impact of that decision is that children are exposed to harm even more now than they were before.
And so just I think one addition on this. So in terms of accountability, there is a clear starting point. So there is a need to be establishing, just going to Pamela's question, there is a need to be establishing an impartial and independent inquiry into the violations that the Saudi-led coalition is perpetrating. But it is not because there isn't actually a starting point in terms of prima facie evidence of IHL and IHRL violations. So just a quick example would be in terms of the incident on the MSF Hayden Hospital on the 25th of October 2015, whereby in the preliminary account that has been given of it, there's been an admission on the part of the general that was responsible, that they were targeting a so-called high-value target, and they did that, quote and unquote, without verifying if there was a hospital nearby. And obviously the question of not verifying if there was a hospital nearby is clear prima facie evidence of not having taken appropriate precautions in terms of international humanitarian law. So there is a basis for already saying war crimes are likely being committed and have been committed in Yemen, the OHCHR report and submissions have said the same, and therefore there is a basis for saying the road to accountability should already begin, even on what we know now.
If I could just go back to your question about our dialogue with the Saudi government and certain members of the coalition. There are 9 Arab states that are members of the Saudi-led coalition. We have repeatedly met with Saudi Arabian government officials, and most recently with the Saudi military spokesman, General Asiri, who was in our offices in Washington. We have sent them detailed letters inquiring about particular strikes, I believe on 9 separate occasions, and have never received a written reply, although I would say that is in keeping with the long custom of the Saudi government not to reply to detailed requests for factual information. General Asiri extended an invitation, a personal invitation, an official invitation for Human Rights Watch to come to Saudi Arabia to meet directly with those responsible for the military decision making. We have repeatedly tried to follow up on that invitation, and we'd be prepared to and have accepted the invitation, and so await our visas from the Saudi government, which I hope you will press them on following up with the invitation they generously extended to us. And I would just note in particular that Saudi, I think, and the Saudi public were among the most vocal critics of Israel's bombardment of southern Lebanon using cluster munitions, in particular, of Israel's bombardment and indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza. And yet it seems stark that there is so little self-reflection about, in particular, the use of cluster munitions, a banned weapon, in Yemen, or the vast indiscriminate bombardment in Yemen. And I would invite all those who have dialogue and conversation with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to think about the parallels between the conduct of Israel that they were so upset by, and yet so apparently oblivious or deflecting of the conduct in Yemen, which they appear satisfied to justify on political grounds.
Thank you. Joe Klein. And,
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Bennett. You cataloged a number of the domestic violations of human rights by Saudi Arabia, but I wanted to ask you to expand on that. For example, in terms of sentences for defamation of religion, apostasy, and also treatment of the gay community in Saudi Arabia. Could you just discuss that? Thank you.
Defamation of religion, apostasy, and gay community. Thank you for the question. We can give examples of sentences of death for defamation of religion. In fact, if you'd care to look at Amnesty International's annual report for 2015, I think we catalog that here, and I'm just going to give you an example of that. In November last year, a Palestinian artist and poet living in Saudi Arabia was sentenced to death after being convicted of apostasy. In fact, an earlier appeal court had overturned his original sentence of 4 years imprisonment and 800 lashes, and instead sentenced him to death. That's one example of a specific case. As we're aware, there are also sanctions against people of different sexual orientation in Saudi Arabia. We could speak more about that, but perhaps with time, due to time, we will leave it
Yep.
at that. Thank you.
Abdelhamid.
Thank you. My name is Abdelhamid Sayam from the daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. And I'm sorry if somebody asked this question before, but I want to ask you about your opinion about the previous report of 2015, when Israel was listed on the list of shame after killing 541 children in Gaza. However, the Secretary General succumbed to pressure. He removed Israel, but there was no fanfare. There was no press conferences. It slipped through the cracks. Nobody criticized. We raised it in the noon briefing day after day, but no answer. So why do you blame Saudi Arabia? If the Secretary General set a precedent to succumb to pressure and remove a country that killed in a war 541 children, then why blame Saudi Arabia? And look at the fanfare and look at the reports and look at those and the Secretary General had to come out and say, I was under enormous pressure. Why he didn't say that when he was pressured to remove Israel from that list? That's one question. When Saudi Arabia was elected to the Human Rights Council, the whole world raised their brows. Why Saudi Arabia should be elected? I agree with that, 100%. But Israel recently had been elected to head the legal committee. Israel is known for one of the most countries that violate international law, day in, day out, simply saying it's an occupying power, occupied country for 49 years, another people. And we don't need to argue that they are in violation of international law. They have been elected now to head a committee that's in charge of international law. What do you say to these two things? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, you are right. Last year, Israel had been put on the list of shame for countries that commit grave violations against children. And before the list was published, we believe through intense Israeli and US pressure, the UN Secretary General decided to take Israel off the list. You are not right, though, that nobody criticized it. In fact, we did criticize it in a very public way and in a very vocal way. And we believe that it was the wrong decision at the time. We demarched the UN Secretary General not to do it. We criticized him publicly after he did it. And in fact, you are right that by doing that, he opened the door for other countries such as Saudi Arabia to do the same. I would say that Saudi Arabia did almost the same. They did it after the list was published, which is even more shocking. This being said, of course, two wrongs do not make a right. And the fact that Israel got away with it doesn't mean that from now on every country should be able to negotiate its way off the list. On your larger question about Israel, I don't know if any of my colleagues can comment. I could say in general that you can just go to our website and you will see that we are an extremely vocal critique of Israeli violations, have been for many years, and I don't think anyone could claim that Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, for that matter, are giving a free pass to anyone.
I would just add, and really, you're asking the flip question that I'm asking you, which is, for every time I or we or organizations point out the Saudi crimes in Yemen, the response is, what about Syria? What about Israel? And so forth. And my response to that is, you're very upset about Palestine. You're very upset about Israel. You're very upset about Syria. You should also, on your own moral, principled standards, be upset about what's happening in Yemen. You can't. I mean, it doesn't work to try to deflect what crimes Saudi is committing in Yemen by talking about other crimes that are being committed anywhere else. Let's all agree that they're all bad, but don't pick and choose.
Nizar Abu Dhabi, Al Mayadeen Television. My quick question is regarding the reformatting the list of shame, which is Leila Zarouki is preparing. The Secretary General has showed intention that to regroup things or make some changes, major changes. How do you view that such an action?
Yeah, I think already I responded to another question to say that it's important to defend this very important mandate to protect children affected by armed conflict. And member states of the General Assembly ought to stand up and defend this mandate. It clearly has been damaged, not only this year, also last year, as was mentioned. And in fact, if one goes back in history, there are questions around Russia in respect of Chechnya, and indeed the UK in respect of Northern Ireland in terms of manipulating this mandate. It's an extremely important tool that the Secretary General has. It ought to be protected. It can be effective. There are some good examples of where it has worked better. I worked in Nepal, for example, where we worked with this mandate more effectively. And member states should stand up for it. Thank you.
We have time for one last question.
Thank you, Ahmed Fathi, ATN News. I hear you loud and clear. You're criticizing the election of Saudi Arabia to the Human Rights Council, the cooperation from the United States, or selling weapons to the Saudis. But isn't it the essence that the appointment to the Human Rights Council is done by member states, the same one you're petitioning to deny membership in the Human Rights Council to them?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The General Assembly certainly is our target in terms of the call. And as you are saying, we are making a call to them on the basis of the commitment, in this case, that they made in Resolution 6251. And therefore, we are saying, to the extent that we have a clear commitment in the Constitutive Act of the Human Rights Council, there is a basis to make the call to the General Assembly member states themselves. We are also saying, in like manner, so for Amnesty International, for instance, our practice, specifically on the question of elections, has not been to support or to oppose the candidature of any particular state. But unlike the question of elections, in this particular case, in terms of a suspension of a member state, we are saying the evidence speaks for itself, and we are hoping that the General Assembly member states will also evaluate that evidence when it comes to Saudi Arabia's candidature in the next elections. But in short, yes, as you say, we are targeting this to the member states themselves of the General Assembly, all of them. And we are saying, because of the rules that you set for yourselves, we are asking that you implement these rules. Don't implement them only in the context of an isolated state, such as Libya, where 6251 was invoked without fanfare, without much ado. Implement it also when a state has powerful backers on the basis of the criterion that is within the resolution, which is gross and systematic violations of human rights.
And remember, Saudi Arabia was elected at the end of 2013. There is now a new situation. This was before the Saudi-led coalition was responsible for close to 2,000 civilian deaths, most of them, or a good number of them, children and women. So we believe that, this was then, this is now. There is a new situation that was created over the last few months, and that's what the members of the General Assembly need to take into account now.
We thank you very much, the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, for the press conference. As I said at the beginning, we were very pleased to have in the same space and to offer the same hospitality to the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to give his version of this subject, important subject for UN correspondent. And we really thank you for this and for your time. I hope to see you soon here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.